Life in ancient Egypt was fairly simple. Most people were farmers. For 8 or 9 months of the year, they tended their small plots of land along the Nile River, growing wheat, fruit, and vegetables. Others raised cattle, sheep, and goats. They tried to feed themselves, pay their taxes, and store enough food to last through the annual inundation. This was the time between July and November when the river rose and flooded most of the farmland. The water eventually receded, leaving a new layer of rich and fertile earth. Between 3000 and 1100 BC, the country was ruled by a long line of kings called pharaohs. Under the pharaohs were members of the royal court, governors of the provinces into which the land was divided, and commanders of the army. Priests and priestesses who officiated at religious ceremonies and attended the many gods that the Egyptians worshipped also served under the pharaohs. Egypt consisted of two narrow strips of farmland, which aligned both banks of the Nile from Aswan in the south to the delta in the north. East and west of the farmland lay hundreds of square miles of desert. This geography created a dependence on the river that ensured efficient communication throughout the land and made complete control by the pharaoh and his army a relatively easy task. Death in ancient Egypt was considered the beginning of a new life in another world. This life, assuming certain precautions were taken, would last forever. Because life on earth was relatively short, the Egyptians built their houses of mud. They built their tombs of stone since life after death was eternal. The Egyptians believed that besides a physical body, everyone had a soul called a ba and a spiritual duplicate of themselves called a ka. When the body died, an individual's ba continued to live here on earth, resting within the body at night. His or her ka, on the other hand, traveled back and forth between the earth and the other world. Eternal life depended on both the ba and the ka being able to identify the body. For this reason, corpses were preserved by the process of mummification. The tomb into which a body was placed had two main functions. It was designed to protect the body from the elements and from thieves who might try to steal the gold and precious objects placed in and around the coffin, and it also had to serve as a house for the ka. The more important the person, the greater his tomb. Since at death pharaohs became gods, their tombs were the largest and most elaborate of all. Between 2700 and 2200 BC, royal tombs were surrounded by a complex of temples and smaller tombs called mastabas. The burial chamber of the king was protected by a man-made mountain of stone called a pyramid. Its four triangular sides, spreading below a single peak, represented the rays of the sun shining down over the pharaoh, linking him directly and for all time to Re, the god of the sun. A temple containing a false door through which the ka traveled was built against the east side of the pyramid. All burial grounds were located on the west bank of the Nile, since it was in the west that the sun set, beginning its nightly journey into the other world, the same journey that the ka had to make. The pyramid and complex of surrounding temples and tombs in this story are imaginary. They are, however, based closely on several of the pyramids and remnants of temples still standing in Egypt. It is generally agreed that earth ramps were used in the construction process, but there is a difference of opinion as to where those ramps were constructed in relation to the pyramid. I have included the two most popular theories in the way that I see them most satisfactorily employed. Although the pyramids failed, in fact, to protect their burial chambers from robbers, they succeeded in making their creators immortal. The pyramids continue to serve as a tribute to those who so skillfully organized the efforts of thousands of people in an attempt to deny the finality of death and the limitations of time by leaving behind something that would last forever. In 2470 BC, a new pharaoh of Upper and Lower Egypt was crowned. The coronation took place in Memphis, the city from which he would rule for 31 years. Earlier pharaohs, including his father, had established the supremacy of Egypt over her neighbors. The military and spiritual supremacy of the pharaoh at home was unquestioned. His soldiers traveled the length of the Nile collecting taxes and keeping a watchful eye over the local governors. Within 2 years, the pharaoh began preparing for the end of his life on earth and the beginning of his eternal life as a god. Accordingly, he instructed Hotep, his architect and best friend, to design a tomb for him that would stand for all time. Even before the plans were complete, a site was chosen on the west bank of the Nile. It was a high plateau overlooking the valley. A few miles to the south stood the great funerary complex at Giza, where the pyramids of 3 earlier pharaohs could be seen. Out of respect to Khufu, the builder of the largest of the Giza pyramids, the pharaoh decreed that his pyramids should be only 470 feet high, 10 feet lower than Khufu's. He compensated for his generosity, however, by choosing a site 20 feet higher than the plateau at Giza. Pyramid, Temenus Wall, Boat Pit, Mortuary Temple, Plan of the Funerary Complex, Causeway, Valley Temple, Nile. Within 2 months, a plan for a complex similar to Giza was finished and presented to the pharaoh. The largest structure was the pyramid, which covered the tomb. To the east stood the mortuary temple in which the pharaoh's ka would sometimes dwell. Extended from both sides of the mortuary temple and enclosing the area around the base of the pyramid was a wall called the Temenos Wall. Farther to the east on the banks of the river stood the valley temple to which the body of the pharaoh would be first brought. The temples were connected by an enclosed passage called the causeway. Large oblong pits were also shown in which the pharaoh's funerary boats were to be buried. Capstone, casing blocks, packing blocks, core blocks. The pyramid itself had 3 main parts. The innermost section was the step-like central core. Only the facing blocks of each sloping band of the core were carefully finished. Second were the packing blocks, which rested on the steps around the core. They were carefully cut and fitted. Third were the outer casing blocks laid against the packing stones. These were of the highest quality and were cut with greater care and precision than any of the others. All 3 parts were constructed simultaneously, one course or layer at a time. Stonecutter, surveyor, mason. Foreman, mortar maker, carpenter. As the plans were being drawn up, several thousand men, including stonecutters, masons, surveyors, mortar makers, carpenters, and general laborers, were brought to the area. They would work all year long either in the quarries or on the site. Barracks and workshops were built at both locations. A larger workforce of over 50,000 men, most of them farmers, was also drafted every year between July and November when the fields were flooded and farming was impossible. They were organized into gangs to transport stone from the quarries to the site. Each gang consisted of 25 men, including a soldier who was the foreman. All the men were paid in food and clothing. Chisels, dolerite ball, mallet. Polishing stones, trowel, hammer, level, square. Adze, boning rods, plumb rule, drill, carpenter's chisel, plumb line, saw. Most of the tools the workmen would use for cutting stone were either made of copper or a very hard stone called dolerite. Handles for tools and most of the measuring instruments were made of wood. Metalworkers were kept busy both at the quarry and on the site sharpening worn tools and manufacturing new ones. As soon as the plan was approved, Hotep ordered the site cleared of sand and rubble in order to expose the rock on which the structures would be built. At the same time, his scribes prepared a list of the necessary stone, giving the amount needed and the size for each block. Copies were sent to the quarries along with orders to begin work. Most of the stone used in the pyramid was limestone, and much of it came from the area around the site. The better quality stone, however, was quarried across the river in Tura. During the inundation, most of this distance could be traveled by water, making the transportation of the heavy stones much easier. To obtain the best limestone, tunnels were dug into the face of the cliffs from which huge caverns were cut block by block. Columns of stone were left standing in the caverns to support the roofs. As each block was cut, it was assigned to a work gang for delivery. Using ropes and heavy timber, levers, the men would first roll the block onto a wooden sled and tie it down. Then they dragged it to a waiting boat along a row of parallel logs embedded in the sand to prevent the runners of the sled from sinking under the weight. All the stones were marked with the name of the work gang that hauled them and checked off the list when they reached the site. Before the building process could begin, the location of true north had to be determined so that the pyramid could be accurately oriented. A circular wall was built approximately in the center of the site. It was built high enough to block a view of the surrounding hills, and the top was made level. This created a perfect horizon line. In the evening, a priest stood in the center of the circle and watched for the appearance of a star in the east. Its position was marked as it rose above the wall, and a line was drawn from that point on the wall to the center of the circle. He watched the star as it moved in an arc through the sky and finally set in the west. As it dropped behind the wall, its position was marked again, and another line was drawn to the center of the circle. Because stars appear to rotate around the North Pole, the priest knew that a third line drawn from the center of the circle through the center of the space between the first 2 lines would point directly north. In November of 2468, the location of the pyramid was marked on the site by Hotep and his surveyors. Several days later, the process was symbolically repeated by the priests in the presence of the pharaoh. Each side of the pyramid was to be 740 feet long, and metal stakes were driven into the rock at the four corners. For 2 weeks, prayers were offered and several animals were sacrificed to the gods to ensure their blessings over the project. Before construction of the pyramid began, the site was leveled. A network of narrow connecting trenches was cut into the rock over the entire area and filled with water, which acted as a level. When the top of the water had been marked on the sides of all the trenches, they were drained. The spaces between the trenches were then cut down to the height of the marks and the trenches themselves filled with stone. The site of the mortuary temple was also leveled and became a work area for the stonecutters. Next, the foundation of the valley temple and causeway were constructed. The former served as an unloading dock, while the latter became a ramp for dragging up the stones. While the site was being leveled, work began on the passage to the tomb. Workers pounded their way through the rock using balls of dolerite. They were followed by men with chisels who carefully finished the four faces of the gradually descending shaft: sarcophagus, tomb, storage room, portcullis. Upon reaching a level 15 feet below the surface, the passage continued a narrow horizontal corridor at the end of which two rooms were cut out. The first would be used for storing the pharaoh's most important possessions. The second was the tomb itself. Both were dug down from the top and would eventually be roofed by massive granite slabs. Channels were built out from the walls of the tunnel, in which granite doors called portcullises were lowered to seal the rooms after the burial. Granite was also used to line the inside of the rooms and to build the first 15 courses of the casing. Most of the stone was cut from the boulders found 600 miles to the south in Aswan and ferried to the site on barges. Huge blocks of both granite and limestone were dragged up the causeway to the work area and transferred onto more easily movable wooden rockers. After the tops and ends were chiseled smooth, each stone was numbered in the order that it would be laid. By September of 2467, the site had been leveled and many blocks were ready to be moved into place. Each one was rolled off its rocker onto several wooden logs standing over the approximate final location. After a thin coat of mortar had been smeared on the ends and bottom of a stone, the logs were removed and it was pushed into place. First, a row of carefully cut limestone paving stones was laid around the base line of the pyramid. Then the granite casing blocks of the first course were pushed into place along a line inscribed on top of the paving stones. As the casing stones of the second course were being dragged into place, work began on the roof over the inner rooms. Since the outer coffin or sarcophagus was too large to be brought through the tunnel, it had to be placed in the burial chamber before the roof was built. First, a wall was constructed to block the doorway between the two rooms, and then the entire burial chamber was filled with sand and rubble. After the sarcophagus had been dragged into the center of the area, workmen tore down the wall and removed the fill. As the level of fill gradually dropped, the sarcophagus was carried down. When it rested safely on the floor, the entire process was repeated to construct the roof. This time, the rooms were both filled with earth formed into a mound that rose above the openings. Large granite slabs were dragged up both sides of the mound, forming a peaked roof. Following careful inspection, the earth was removed through the tunnel. Skilled stonecutters then finished the granite facing, which lined the interior of the chambers. The area enclosed by the casing stones was next filled with core and packing blocks, and all the tops were leveled in preparation for the second course. Overseers checked the work constantly because any poorly finished surfaces could weaken the entire pyramid. By the following summer, the first course was complete and all the stones for the second course had arrived. Unlike the stones of the first course, which were moved into place fairly easily, the stones of the other 123 courses had to be raised to the top of the preceding course before they could be pushed into place. Hotep solved this problem by building ramps of rubble held together with Nile mud. One ramp began at each corner of the pyramid and rose gradually along the side, resting on the unfinished steps of the casing. Logs, embedded in the top of the ramp, helped reduce deterioration under the runners of the sleds. As each course was finished, the ramps were extended by workmen whose job it was to build and maintain them. As soon as the ramps were ready, work gangs began hauling the blocks for the second course into place. Usually 20 men pulled the sled while the others either pushed from behind with levers or poured liquid on the roadway to reduce friction under the runners. As the base of the pyramid grew, the tunnel leading to the tomb was extended through it. The blocks over the roof of the tunnel were laid to form a peak-like those over the inner chambers. By this method, the enormous weight of the upper courses was directed around the tunnel.